this is an important issue for the working class of the world and for the defense of democratic rights, communication rights, and for journalists particularly, and whistleblowers. And my name is Steve Zeltzer. I produce a show called Workweek Radio and have been active in the labor movement for many years. And it is a very important issue, the right of free speech, whistleblowers, and journalists, because this issue is about the right of the working class to have information. And of course, the capitalist governments do not want us to have information unless they control and sanitize that information. And that is what is going on in the United States, England, and other countries. And the whistleblowers like Julian Assange and others are speaking out because they believe that the people of this country and of this world need to have this information. And I would add that the information that has been released by WikiLeaks has shown to be war crimes committed by the US government against the people of the world. And despite the fact that they're blatant war crimes, not one Democrat or Republican in Congress has called for prosecution of these war criminals for these war crimes. And it is interesting that while they refuse to call for prosecution of the war criminals, they are calling for the prosecution of Julian Assange. So I would say that's duplicity and hypocrisy. Why would they call for the prosecution of Julian Assange and not for the prosecution of the crimes of the United States military in Iraq and around the world? So we have a double standard going on in this country, and I think that the case of Julian Assange, the necessity of defending Julian Assange is critical for all whistleblowers and journalists, and also needs to be taken up in the labor movement, in the trade unions. And one of the things that we have done is we introduced a resolution at the KPFA local station board. We're trying to get a vote on it, but there are many people in the KPFA, or some people, who don't believe that he should be defended. They say he's a tool of the Russians, blame the Russians. And that's a massive hysteria in the United States. The Russians are behind everything. The Russians are behind the failure of the Clinton in the elections. The Russians are controlling the United States. I mean, we continue to organize. We've had 2 rallies, a defense campaign here in the Bay Area, Northern California, and take this also nationally into Pacifica, because Pacifica should be as well supporting Julian Assange. If you don't support democratic rights for Julian Assange, what do you support as far as a free speech network and for against war and militarization? So that's an issue that has to be addressed. Okay, so our next speaker is Nozomi Hayase. She's a journalist and author and a writer, and she's written extensively on the case of Julian Assange. Welcome, Nozomi.
Hi. So, you all of you can donate to Assange's Legal Defense Fund, and which is IamWikiLeaks.org, and you can make your contribution to support Julian Assange that way. So what was happening 50 years ago here in the Bay Area? Does anyone remember? Yes. What was happening? Huh? Yeah, 50. So, you all of you can donate to Assange's Legal Defense Fund, and which is IamWikiLeaks.org, and you can make your contribution to support Julian Assange that way. So what was happening 50 years ago here in the Bay Area? Does anyone remember? Yes. What was happening? Huh? Yeah, 15 solitary confinement. And this has been done by the US government punishing Julian Assange for his publishing activities with WikiLeaks, okay? And so obviously, the moment for free speech. In the same way, perhaps, Mario Savio fought for free speech 50 years ago. And if you look at it, what's happening currently now in the US, where are people fighting for free speech? Where are democratic parties and progressives and left? They're all turned against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Ever since the organization published the documents pertaining to DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta, then, the mainstream media engaged in this McCarthy-era hysteria, portraying Julian Assange as Russia's intelligence agent, right? Or even saying Julian Assange is a Trump supporter, which he's not, okay? So this is very important. I've been researching about WikiLeaks because I was so passionate about what this organization has done, especially in empowering ordinary people around the world. And I feel it's very important for us to look at this organization from a larger perspective, to understand what this organization is, and then why it's important for us to support Julian Assange and this organization. So WikiLeaks, as we all know, is a whistleblowing site. It's a non-profit media organization that is 100% publicly funded. And we are not just talking about American people. We are talking about people around the world. And it's just simply publicly funded journalistic organization. And the role of WikiLeaks, basically, it publishes original sources, government secrecy, classified documents, basically the documents that have never been published before. So what we have is the world first global forces state. So until the birth of this organization, we never had the global forces state. And WikiLeaks being launched in 2007, it published over 10 million documents with pristine record of accuracy. So far, all the documents are authenticated. And it has published more classified information than all the media combined, exposing human rights abuses, government spying, and war crimes on a scale that was unprecedented. And it won many prestigious journalistic awards. So obviously, this is a very excellent journalistic organization, effective, competent, excellent journalistic organization. But I think that maybe perhaps the WikiLeaks is much more than just a journalistic organization, and that the best way to describe this organization is to look at it as an invention of new journalism. And just as Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century radically changed Europe, right, because of what happened with this invention. Does anyone know? This was revolutionary technology, printing press. What happened out of this?
Protestant Reformation.
Right, so ordinary people were able to read the Bible, and they didn't have to refer to the central authority anymore. And this led to the decline of church's authority, right? So in the same way, WikiLeaks, as a new invention of journalism, brought tremendous revolutionary and disruptive forces. And just as many innovations that tend to solve problems of the existing society, WikiLeaks solved many problems that we have. So the first problem that we have is managed democracy. So many of us, especially Americans, tend to think that we have democracy in this country. We have democracy, we have free press, we have freedom of speech, right? But in fact, we don't have democracy. What we have is Western, what is described as Western liberal democracy.
Which one?
Here in the US, we have representative democracy, Western liberal democracy. But that is actually a managed democracy. And if you know this man, Edward Bernays, he's the father of PR, public relations, he's the father of propaganda, he actually believed the ordinary people, the people who are not educated, they are not capable of governing themselves. Thus, they need ruling elite, the people who are capable to govern them. So that was the idea of managed democracy. So what we have is managed democracy, and then how the managed democracy works is that it pretty much depends on secrecy, because they need to keep their activities in secret so that they can effectively control masses. And one of the functions is to restrict, the first thing that they have to do is to restrict free speech. And then create corporate media. So media currently function as a propaganda machine. And then in this paradigm, journalists became professionals, right? They are professional journalists. And then their job is to guard the secrecy and become gatekeeper of power. So WikiLeaks solved all of these problems. right? That's very revolutionary. How did this organization do it? And many people like to portray Julian Assange as a libertarian, or he's left socialist or whatever. Many people like to project their own political agendas onto him. But actually, WikiLeaks was conceived by the philosophy of cypherpunks. And cypherpunks is an online activist group who advocate privacy for the use of strong cryptography. So what they believed in was that instead of engaging in the political effort to pressure politicians and then create change laws and create social change, they simply thought that maybe we should just deploy disruptive technology and then allow ordinary people to do what they believe to be their legal right. Then maybe society in the end will change to reflect these values. So cypherpunks basically, Assange as one of notable cypherpunks. He was engaged in this group since 1995. He defined human struggles not left versus right, but institution versus individuals. And then he basically created this anonymous secure online submission system. So this is a breakthrough of technology, the anonymous secure online submission system. This allows basically ordinary people to submit materials without their identity being tracked. And this was really revolutionary because without us having privacy, we really don't have free speech. If we are concerned and if we are afraid of the consequence of our speech, we cannot fully engage in exercising our right to free speech. And WikiLeaks made it possible for us to have true free speech. And so organization made free speech permissionless, borderless, and censorship-free. And what was amazing about WikiLeaks is it's really distributed the free speech right around to the entire world. So now people anywhere with access to internet through WikiLeaks can engage in exercising free speech. And now this anonymous secure online submission system is, many people probably know as secure Dropbox. And this technology has been implemented into mainstream media. So New York Times has one, First Look has one, Guardian has one. Many of them just follow WikiLeaks inspiration and then incorporated this. So out of this amazing, technical infrastructure, WikiLeaks created something called scientific journalism. And this is another one of the unique aspects of WikiLeaks. And this sets WikiLeaks apart from any other journalistic organization that came before. So just like scientific papers, right? When we have scientific papers, researchers are required to release all information, all experimental data they use to form conclusions, right? So in the same way, WikiLeaks releases all the material. It releases full archives in a searchable format so that people like us, the ordinary people, can independently check the interpretation and the summary of what journalists make. And this is really revolutionary because if you look at this current model of journalism, where they use creed of objectivity, that's the very important professional creed. The professional journalists say, we are objective, and we decide. And their role is to decide what is of public interest, and then what is to be withheld, what is to be released, and how information to be presented and interpreted. That's what the role of professional journalists are, right? And in this, we simply have to believe in journalists. Journalists say, this is the information, this is the news, and we have to just simply believe it. And the WikiLeaks, basically through scientific journalism, made it possible for us not to simply trust journalists, because all we have to do is to look at documents. We don't have to trust what journalists say. We just have to look at the documents. And then with this, it's enabled true accountability Because in our, under this mandate of democracy, not only we don't have ways to account for elected officials, but we don't even have ways to account for journalists, right? So then how can we have democracy in this condition? So WikiLeaks made it possible. So now public can just simply access through archives and then research and then independently check the credibility of journalists. So here, corporate media, this is, they basically write what they are told, right, by the officials. And then they conceal information, they distort and conceal information, and then create news to manipulate public opinion. And we have very good, corporate media, right, in this country. I mean, they are so good at distorting information and manipulating information. And then what they do is that their purpose is to control historical narrative. And that they use electoral arena as a control grid. So we have lesser of two evils every 4 years. It's just recycled back again and again, and many of us fall into this, right? And then WikiLeaks, on the other hand, its purpose is to reveal information that have been suppressed. So WikiLeaks doesn't just publish anything. They go after certain information. And that information is the one that is oppressed. And then Assange basically analyzed the information that has been suppressed sends economic signal, because that shows that someone spent energy and resources to oppress the information, right? So that means if we liberate the information, it has tremendous potential to create social change. So they go after subjugated history and restore accurate record of history and collective memory. And perhaps the good example, I personally find that this is the most important example of what WikiLeaks does, the publication of a collateral matter video. And in this, we are able to see the truth, right? The corporate media portray these people, Afghans and Iraqi civilians, as enemy combatant. They create a narrative to demonize these people. But what we saw from Manning's release was that they are humans. And we are humans too. And we are, this is what Chelsea Manning said. We are human, and we are killing ourselves. And this is the truth that have been covered by corporate media. And the same is said about Russia, that this whole Russia gate. What do Americans have something to do with Russians, right? We are conditioned by this corporate media to look at people in other countries as adversaries, either allies or adversaries. So I grew up in Japan, for instance, and I was conditioned in some ways by the mainstream media there to look at Chinese people as enemies. And then over time, I made friends. I personally get to know them, and then realized that they are just like me, just like, Japanese people. And then they are not what my government portrayed them to be. So in the same way, the corporate media trying to divide humanity into nationality, race, and all those things, so that we don't really wake up to our own humanity. So how did governments and institutions around the world respond to this innovation of journalism? And United States government aggressively reacted and trying to silence Julian Assange and prosecute the organization. And this has turned into the war against the First Amendment. This is a global phenomenon being broadcasted now on the internet. It's very embarrassing, right? The United States betraying its own principle and trying to destroy the First Amendment. And this is the quote from Julian Assange. He said, "We embarked on a mission to bring the First Amendment to the world. Little did we realize that our greatest struggle will come in 2010 as we try to bring the First Amendment to the United States." And various threats was brought by United States. For instance, WikiLeaks was subject to financial blockade by private companies like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, Bank of America, et cetera, Western Union, et cetera. And these private paying processing companies, they got signal from the US State Department, and then they basically engaged in illegal economic censorship by destroying over 90% of revenue, public donations that would have gone to WikiLeaks, and a large percentage of that donation came from American public. So, through engaging in the financial blockade, the United States government basically obstructed our right to free speech. And the secret grand jury has been active since 2010, and then Julian Assange and then WikiLeaks associate has been under investigation. And then we know this character assassination of Julian Assange.
He's a rapist.
Right, rapist. And then the recent one is a cat torturer. He tortures cat. I mean, that has been reported quite widely. And, and also Mossad agent, Putin's, I can write another book about this, right? Okay, so this has been going on. And to just be clear, this war against the First Amendment started under Obama administration, under President Obama. And Obama, despite his campaign promise to create a transparent government, he has been engaged in persecution of whistleblowers more than, he has persecuted whistleblowers more than any other president, more than any previous president. And then this aggressive persecution of whistleblowers and the war against the First Amendment is continuing on with Trump administration. So Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, last year, April, he said Assange's arrest is a priority. And then Mike Pompeo, a former CIA director, now Secretary of State, he said he called WikiLeaks as non-state intelligence service. Non-state intelligence service, okay? And that needs to be shut down. So still, this aggression, the United States government's aggression or empire's aggression toward free speech is full on. And the assault on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange obviously concerned the issue of press freedom, but it goes much deeper. So what is this war on free speech? What is this battle about? Anyone? Does anyone know or wish to comment? What is this? What are they trying to do by destroying free speech?
Continue their domination.
Domination. And what is this battle about? Who are we fighting against? Protect the corporation. Then who are we fighting against? Are we fighting against Trump? Or are we fighting against what? Who? Capitalism. So capitalism? So we are fighting against a certain kind of system, right? Yeah. Maybe political system or economic system. So let's look back, look at what Mario Savio actually said, because he was very much engaged in this battle. In one of his famous, or this is actually his first speech, he said, there is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so obvious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. So he was pointing to this operation of the machine. And we now have the same thing. This operation of the machine still continuing on, and it's actually increasing its power. So we had unaccounted power from the very beginning of this country. Okay, we tend to kind of worship founding fathers, but they are, white male property owners, and their power has not been accounted, right? And then this power, unaccounted power, moved into corporations, corporate personhood. And these artificial entities, they are not humans, right? They gained more rights than actual human beings. And then now, these artificial entities are taking over the whole planet. And now it has gone beyond. It got to the next level with artificial intelligence, trying to insert control through algorithm. And the internet has become a battleground. So we now know, tech giants, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, they engage in surveillance and censorship. So internet has been effectively turned into a battleground. So now, as Julian Assange said in 2010, we are approaching Orwell's dictum. Julian said, he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind. And by controlling that, controls our perception of who we are, and by controlling that, controls what laws and regulations we make in society. So we have now this situation where Western journalist, innovator of this amazing, brilliant new journalism, has been kept in solitary confinement. Why was he punished? He was not punished just because he was an excellent, courageous journalist. He was punished because he understands the nature of this battle. And he and his organization, WikiLeaks, are in the front line of this battle. That's why they go after Julian. And now we have to recognize this is much more than just a political issue. And for Mario, freedom of speech was not a tactic, not something to win political advantage. Mario Savio said, it was, for him, freedom of speech was something that represents the very dignity of what a human being is. It marks us off from the stones and the stars. It's the thing that marks us as just below the angels. So he said, the freedom of speech is represents the very dignity of what a human being is. And in 2010, we have seen this dignity once again arose to the global stage. And it was WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. They are the ones who brought this back so that we can restore our humanity and we can claim our own history. And we are still being in the managed democracy, being controlled. So Edward Bernays said, we are governed, our mind are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested. And the WikiLeaks, through the disclosure of government secrecy, was trying to free us from this control. So Julian said, we are walking around constantly in this fog where we cannot see the ground. These disclosures are a break in the fog. So what is at stake is really future of our civilization. Free speech rights allow us to express our creativity and then for us to remain human. And if we don't have this ability to express our creativity, we are doomed as a species. So it's very important for us to stand up for Julian Assange, and our effort to free Julian Assange must become global free speech movement. And I missed the first one because I wasn't born, but I very much like to participate with all of you, this new global free speech movement. So free Julian Assange and free WikiLeaks and defend WikiLeaks' right to publish. And then these are the things that maybe you can do. You can certainly donate to WikiLeaks Defense Fund and contact the Congress members to raise support for Julian Assange. And then also there's a movement, global movement built online called Unify for J. So you can join this group as well. Thank you.
So one of the issues of free speech and democratic rights is the question of journalists and the right of journalists to do their work. And there is a campaign to defend journalists, but interestingly enough, the journalists in the United States have not been at the forefront of defending Julian Assange. Now, why is that? They're quite happy about attacking Trump, and he deserves to be attacked for calling media and journalists scum. But the fact of the matter is, Julian Assange has been threatened with death by congressmen. He's been accused, they want to torture him, and they'd like to kill him. That's what they want to do. And despite these vicious attacks by politicians, elected politicians, and by other right-wing forces who want to silence him, and left-wing forces in the Democratic Party, there's been silence of the journalist unions. And this is a serious problem, because you cannot just defend some people's free speech. You cannot just defend some whistleblowers. It's really an acceptance of a capitalist framework. That's what we're talking about. The right of the capitalists to decide who's going to have free speech. That is really what we're talking about. So our next speaker is John Holmes. He's a retired member of the CWA Pacifica Media Workers Guild, and also he's a author of an upcoming book, I think, and hopefully upcoming book. And also he's a professor at Peralta Community Colleges. Welcome, John Holmes.
Just to quickly review and get us back to what's going on here right now. So Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, is trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he sought asylum in the year 2012 after Swedish prosecutors demanded his extradition on completely bogus charges of rape. Despite the fact that the Swedish authorities dropped the charges last year, London police have said they will arrest Assange for violating his bail on that case on which the charges have been dropped if he leaves the embassy. So the pressure is now on tiny Ecuador from Britain and the USA to kick him out. And then Britain would do what the US authorities have wanted all along, and the Americans, Brits, and Swedes all used to deny and extradite him to the USA, where God alone knows what America's secret police would do to him to extract out of him everything he knows. There's a lot of talk about human rights, but it seems, to misquote George Orwell, that some humans have more rights than others. Now, I'm speaking here as the only representative of the labor movement, unfortunately. Until the month of July, Steve and I were the Human Rights Committee of the Media Workers Union. We got kicked out of that committee as we kept bringing up human rights cases our union leadership thought were too controversial. For example, such as journalists getting beaten up by police in anti-Trump rallies that they agonized over for months before they finally decided it was safe to say something or other. That's about right, Steve? Yeah. Because, after all, it was a journalist, so they finally decided they could go with that one. We never even tried to get the union to defend Julian Assange because we knew exactly the response that we would have gotten. Now, there's been talk about journalist objectivity, which is something I happen to know a whole lot about. So I'm going to give you some information about that. Well, first of all, the cult of objectivity, number one, the cult of objectivity is something that only came about in the news media in the 1950s during the McCarthy era as a sort of a safety measure. Now, as I was being automated out of my job as a printer in the 90s, I managed to go to college. I ended up getting a PhD in history. And the first thing I learned in a history methodology class, they have classes on history, they call them boot camps for historians. But anyway, the first thing I learned is that there's no such thing as objectivity. Everyone has a point of view. Those who claim otherwise are deceiving either you or usually themselves. Okay, so now how does journalistic objectivity actually work? I can actually tell you, because I was working as a printer at various newspapers for 20 years, in particular in the 1980s when things at the Hayward Daily Review newspaper. Now, here's the way journalistic objectivity actually works. Okay, with the AP, Associated Press, which is at least used to be the main source for all news about everything in newspapers. So basically, what the editors are told at AP, and by the way, my father was an AP editor at one point, so I've got some knowledge about that. What the journalists were told at the Associated Press was, well, there's basically 2 points of view on every story. You've got the liberal point of view and the conservative point of view, okay? So in the interest of objectivity, you need to include both viewpoints. And they were also told, always put the conservative viewpoint first in the first half of the story, and the liberal viewpoint in the second half of the story. I had the job of, making up newspaper pages, of trimming the stories. And in fact, in the early and mid 80s, pretty much often the lazy copy editors would simply let the printers do it. So I would do that. And what I immediately noticed was the fact that the conservative version was always first, the liberal version was always second, and the whole for an article was usually just about the right size. So if you just trimmed it, you'd trim out the liberal version and keep the conservative version. Okay, that's how it actually worked. Okay. Now, since I was doing the trimming, there's a few times I had a little fun with that, let's say. There was a time that Oliver North came to town in Hayward, and I had a lot of fun trimming that one, to the point that some of the conservative readers actually sent in letters to the editors to complain about it. But anyway, that's another story. So that's how journalistic objectivity actually works, at least in the 1980s in the news media. By the 90s, it was taken away from the printers, and the copy editors would have more control. But whatever. So that's journalistic objectivity in our corporate news media. The New York Times always like to say, all the news that fits we print. Well, I was the guy who trimmed it to make sure that fit. Okay, trimming out what was seen as the liberal version often. Okay, So the American labor movement, most certainly including the newspaper industry, which is dying, which is why I got automated out of my job about 15 years ago, is feeble, battered, scared, stiff, and generations deep in the arms of the Democratic Party, which hates Julian Assange like poison. I'll get to that later. Which is absolutely tragic because any serious effort at protest against the misdeeds of the US government, any defense of immigrants against deportation, any defense of black people against police violence, indeed any mobilization of working people against the steadily increasing, pardon me, impoverishment they're being subjected to in America and around the world is unlikely to get far without the backing of the only organizations working people have to defend themselves against the crimes of our corrupt, vicious, imperialist, white racist, male chauvinists, and generally just plain vicious ruling class here in America. Okay? Now, as I've said, I'm a member of the Media Workers Union as a retired printer, not a journalist. But my father being an AP journalist and me being now a history professor, getting active, by the way, in the Peralta Federation of Teachers drive. The Peralta Federation of Teachers is not quite as subservient to the employers as the Newspaper Workers Union, so they're actually involved in hiring me to do a little recruitment drive at my home campus, Merritt College, the proud home of the Black Panther Party, which I'm delighted to be a teacher at. Anyway, so I've done some research on the rape case and want to say a few words about it, as there are altogether too many people in this era of Me Too who automatically believe anyone accused of rape and harassment is automatically guilty. But these accusations spread all over the media are pure and simple, to coin a phrase, fake news. Okay, I don't know if you ever heard that phrase before. But anyway, they were so phony that the Swedish prosecutor refused for 5 years to even interview Julian Assange about them unless he first gave himself up to Swedish custody. Then they would condescend to interview him. Okay? One of the accusers turned out to be a cousin of the commander of the Swedish forces in Afghanistan. Okay? And for good measure, had been involved in a CIA-backed anti-Cuban, CIA-backed anti-Cuban organizations. Okay? Then there's the other accuser. I should say, by the way, I think it's a very good guess that her relationship with Assange was an example of a classic trick in the spy game called the honeypot. And if you don't know what that is, look it up on the internet. Okay? It would be hard to prove, but my suspicion is the scheme to victimize Assange with its pseudo-feminist touches sprang from the fertile brain of the then head of the State Department, a woman named Hillary Rodham Clinton. Okay? That's my opinion. Hard to prove. And then there's the other accuser. Before she hooked up with Assange, she had been a rock star groupie in Lou Reed's entourage. Okay? And guess what? She tried to withdraw the charges that Mrs. 007 talked her into filing, but the Swedish authorities would not let her. That's a little hidden fact. You have to do a lot of research to find that out. Like I said, the charges were dropped about a little over a year ago. Why is that? Because they served their purpose. Now it's up front and out in the open that it wasn't the phony rape charges that the Swedes were going after him for WikiLeaks exposures of the crimes of US imperialism that we've heard some talk about here today. Sweden being a US lapdog. Those Swedish soldiers in Afghanistan, commanded by the cousin of the accuser of the main accuser of Julian Assange, were supposedly there to defend women's rights, you see. Right? Yeah, sure. Now, liberals and conservatives are baying for Assange's blood side by side. The liberals want to get him arrested for allegedly helping Donald Trump get elected by revealing Hillary Clinton's dirty tricks to the world. Even before the outbreak of liberal conspiracy mongering over alleged Russian interference in our wonderful American elections, which poor people, especially blacks and Latinos, get excluded from by every trick in the book, liberals considered Assange dangerous because, unlike legitimate mainstream mouthpieces like the New York Times, he refuses to redact the material that WikiLeaks publishes. He releases every dirty detail of American crimes, even if it reveals what those intelligence agencies the liberals have fallen back in love with are lately up to around the world, right? Democrats came to despise Assange even more after WikiLeaks released a trove of emails in 2016, hacked by the Russians, so the story goes, from the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, which supposedly was the only reason Trump got elected, right? Since the election, Democrats have pulled out all the stops in an effort to persuade the world that we was robbed. by an attack of hackers operating under the command of Putin with the intent of undermining American democracy by electing Putin's puppet, Donald Trump, the Manchurian candidate. Okay? Their proof, what was their proof? It's a gilt-edged report prepared by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, those great truth tellers of all time. They supposedly tracked the chain of command to the Kremlin. Except none of the evidence for this wild conspiracy theory got released to the public because it's all top secret, you see. And if you believe that, there's this really nice bridge in Brooklyn that I'd love to sell you cheap. It's, you'd be amazed how cheap I'll sell it to you for. Now, Donald Trump and the so-called anti-Trump resistance are united in trying to get the CIA's hands on Assange so he can be packed off to Guantanamo and tortured to reveal all of WikiLeaks' secrets. And this is all justified by what? The bizarre claim, which all too many anti-Trump liberals and even leftists are buying into, that Julian Assange and Donald Trump are both agents of Vladimir Putin. And then they have the gall to accuse Trump of circulating conspiracy theories. This is an extreme case of the pot calling the kettle black. Okay? What's really going on here? It's the mainstream Democrats who really aren't that different from the Republicans, as it just proved, but the orgy of sadness of the death of anti-Asian racist war criminal John McCain, whose bombs dropped on cities in Vietnam probably killed more innocent civilians than Osama bin Laden did in New York. Okay? They're deliberately trying to divert the hatred that so many people feel against Trump for his real crimes against the only thing Donald Trump has done in his time in office he does not belong in prison for. Namely, is not quite as eager to go to war against Russia, and for that matter, North Korea, as are the Democrats. Plus, in their play for an alliance with the mainstream Republicans versus Trump, they are bringing back old-style 1950s Joe McCarthy anti-communism. As if Russia, one of the most capitalist countries in the world, was communist. Look, I've been to Russia. I was there in 2001 during 9/11. Well, thereby hangs the tale, I'm not going to tell. I won't get into what I saw there, but I'll tell you one thing. When I got home from Russia to America, I had this bizarre impulse to kiss the ground and say, my God, thank God I'm back in a socialist country. Okay. And guess what? Bernie Sanders and all those so-called Democratic socialists getting elected lately, things have gotten so bad in this country that if you're an FDR New Deal Democrat, you call yourself a socialist. Okay? So, Bernie Sanders and that woman in New York and so forth getting elected in and out of the DSA have jumped right in and fallen right in line with the mainstream demos on the anti-Russian hysteria. And indeed on just about all the crimes of U.S. imperialism, dirty business for Israel, you name it. They're all in line for it, including all those who are members of the Democratic Socialist Alliance, which now it's got a lot of young people. 20 or 30 years ago, I used to call it the Democratic Socialites Anonymous. But anyway, meanwhile, what are the Trump people up to? Remember, it's not the Democrats now masterminding the campaign against Assange. It's the Trump administration, right? With, of course, the full support of the Democrats, whether mainstream or socialist. And here I have to bring up an unpleasant subject. A band of ultra-cynical right-wing provocateurs, Trump followers and alt-right semi-fascists, this was already mentioned by Randy Credico, I appreciated that, have tried to jump on the bandwagon of what little movement for Assange exists right now. As we saw it on the very last slide, the main vehicle rallies for Assange lately in the United States, I think there's more significant things going on in other countries, but here in the United States, the main vehicle is an internet thing in cyberspace, having internet vigils, a very strange concept to me. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. Once a month for Assange, Unity for J. Some of you are probably familiar with it even, before today. It's run by libertarians who have welcomed this crowd into the movement with open arms. So the Unity for J Twitter feed, the basis for trying to organize internet speakouts and the occasional flash mob at embassies, has been virtually taken over lately by right-wingers. I subscribed to it back in July. I've seen the transformation over the last few months, who are using it as a platform lately for things like defending the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh. One guy I saw on it, some of you may have heard of, Sebastian Gorka. Anyone ever heard of him? He's now on Unity for J, my God. And thereby, by the way, giving credence to all the liberals claiming that Assange is fronting, if not for Putin, at least for Donald Trump. Okay? The people running it defend this on the basis there should be no politics in the movement and everybody should be welcome. On that basis, they're letting it turn into something that looks a lot like a movement for Trump in the last few weeks. Well, there's no such thing as no politics in the movement or anything else. Politics abhors a vacuum. Okay? If we're going to get any real movement for Assange going on, these characters' voices need to be burned out of the movement with a red-hot iron. And I think they know that. I think they are so-called supporting Assange as they understand that's the best way to destroy any movement for him. That's my opinion.
And Abby Martin just made a statement about that too, listing the
characters. Yeah. So let me summarize. What's going on right now in the political world in general? You have an unholy alliance. You have Trump and the alt-right fascist fringe he has nurtured, whipping up hatred of Mexican and Muslim foreigners based on racism and crazy conspiracy theories. And the Democrats, who noticed that xenophobia and hatred of foreigners was a winning card for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, are whipping up hatred of Russians, foreigners, based on leftover Cold War anti-communism and equally crazy conspiracy theories. And both sides are united to shut the mouths of the truth-tellers like Julian Assange. By unmasking the people who run this country's everyday lies, intrigues, and wanton slaughter, brave whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and Julian Assange have done a great service to the entire world. I say, hands off Julian Assange.
100 years after the Russian Revolution, they've won. You know, they control the United States now. So this, in my view, is basically a canard to avoid the issues of what is happening with the United States. What are the real, who are the real criminals, and what is causing this system crisis? Credico, and he is a journalist, writer, activist, and he also had a program in the past on WBAI in New York, which is part of the Pacifica network, and he has taken up the defense of Julian Assange. He knows Julian Assange, and he himself has been subpoenaed to go before these congressional witch hunters to talk about the relationship with Russia. And of course, they want to impugn him and anybody else that supports Julian Assange. So we have him by phone, and he's going to talk about the issue of Julian Assange and why this is important to the people of the world and people in the United States to defend him. So welcome, Randy Credico.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. And thank you for that nice introduction. I would say I'm more of a political satirist than a journalist, although I have been doing a lot of things correspondent-wise with Dennis Bernstein on Flashpoint. So, and then as a radio host, I guess I play the role of a journalist. That's the reason why I am not going to I took the fifth with the House. Now I got a Senate subpoena en route, and they want all sorts of documents and stuff. Well, I'm going to rebuff that. I'm not going to comply with that, because anything that I've ever spoken to Mr. Assange about is my business, his business, and none of their business. So I will protect my sources. And, I was out there last year at this time doing reports. I visited Mr. Assange 3 times last year between September and November. And it all had to do with this lawsuit by the La Repubblica from Italy's Stefano Marizzi, who had a suit against the Crown Prosecutor Services to get emails between the British government, CPS, and the Swedish prosecutor. They had been forced, they had been shanghaied, the prosecutor in Sweden, by the British government to continue their investigation, even though there was no grounds for it. So they put the pressure on, her name was Marian Nye, for years and years. And so, but they never got the email. She couldn't get the emails. But Mr. Assange, the only silver lining was he was declared a journalist by this body of jurists. So that's when that's what I was doing over there. And I talked to him, and we will not discuss anything with the Senate. That being said, Mr. Assange, of course, is a journalist. He's a publisher. He's an editor. Whistleblowers go to him, just like Daniel Ellsberg went to the Times and the Washington Post. And so he gets stuff from whistleblowers, and Assange gives it to other papers and gives it to other publications and other news outlets. CNN, they all published his stuff, but he's the only one being targeted. He's the only one who shared the Manning, the war logs, and he, being prosecuted, and for the DNC stuff. Now, they keep laying this on the Russians. I can tell you for sure he did not get this from the Russians. But people are hysterical. Look, there's no one who dislikes Trump more than I do. I was with William Kunstler all of those years, and with the Central Park Five and everything. I've never liked Trump. His foreign policy is the most reactionary since Dr. Strangelove. All right, so that's what you have. You've got Nikki Haley. You've got Pompeo. You got Mattis. I mean, they're all react. They make Jeane Kirkpatrick look like a leftist. All right, so this is what we have. Kissinger looked good. That's his staff and his cabinet, his war cabinet, is a very scary collection of warmongers and neocons. So this is not Julian Assange's person. If he was out right now and he was able to practice what he does, his profession, he would be exposed in this. He'd be exposing what's going on in Syria. He'd be exposing what's going on in Ukraine by the U.S., our expansion into Africa, what's going on in Venezuela right now. We don't have that voice. That voice is being squelched by this bogus charge of him under the Espionage Act, basically, The First Amendment applies to everybody in this country. This is not Rome, where, Roman citizens had rights that their empire did not have. So, he's not someone like people in Egypt did not have the rights of a Roman citizen. That's what they're doing here with Julian Assange. Everybody here has the First Amendment rights, but nobody from overseas. Well, that's complete hogwash. And he's a great guy. He's a brave guy. He's been there for 6 years and 3 months. Since June 16 would have been 6 years. And he's been incommunicado. The U.S. government has put an extraordinary amount of pressure on the new president of Ecuador, Linda Moreno. Unlike Rafael Correa, didn't buckle. But, the U.S. is putting pressure. What are they afraid of? What are you afraid that this guy is going to expose things that you've done that are wrong? Just don't do wrong things, and they'll be... Just don't do bad things. Don't, invade other countries. Don't get involved in coups. Don't be involved in torture. Don't have 3 million people in prison, 90% black and Latino on drug charges. This is what's wrong with this country, is that we have a bad record, and he's exposing it. All you have to do is cut that out, and you put Julian Assange out of business.
Is that all?
So that's not going to happen. But there's a network. I'm going to continue supporting him. There's a lot of groups out there. There's also some alt-right people that I don't get along with that are supporting him. We shouldn't be confused by them because they have their own agenda. They don't like me. I've had threats. I've been maligned. I've been smeared by them. So only because I went on television, I said that Roger Stone's depiction of me being a back channel, no one would, as Craig Murray said last week on my show in New York, my live stream show, I wouldn't trust Randy Credico with a pair of socks, let alone some kind of, It's like, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. The logic, why would Assange give me something to give to Trump when he could just do it directly? First of all, who knows how they got a hold of it? He says it wasn't a state actor. I believe him. Was it a leak? Was it a hack? There's so much confusion out there. I believe it was a leak and not a hack. That's my belief. And to tie this to Russia, now I got the Hillary people who hate me too, as if I gave Hillary Clinton a map of the United States for a campaign that excluded Michigan and Wisconsin. That was all my fault. It was her own fault. She had a lousy campaign. She was the only one that could lose to Donald Trump. And so that was I'm very upset that he's the president. I would be upset if she were the president. I supported Sanders and then Jill Stein in the general election. I never supported Trump. But they think, They think that I was just back channel and helped out Trump. So I got them the Hillary people who don't like me, and I've got the alt-right people who don't like me, and it's uncomfortable at times going out in public. So I would say that to do what you're doing today, people need to understand what this is about. If Assange is prosecuted, if he's delivered to the U.S., you know that Trump is going to prosecute him. He calls everybody the enemy of the press. That includes Assange. So the people from the Times Council came out and said that this would be a dangerous precedent if they were to prosecute him under the Espionage Act or the Alien Sedition Act, whatever the one from 1917, where people were just like thrown into prison for no reason at all. Eugene Debs, Robert Goldstein, the film director, so many people who were thrown in for long periods of time. So it is scary. This is kind of a Red Scare thing happening in its own weird way. But I think that we should all be circling the wagons around Julian Assange instead of circling a firing squad, because going after him, the press, they are engaging in a collective suicide, because they're next. If Assange, and you see some of these people, Ken Delaney from MSNBC, folks like that, Jim Acosta slamming Assange, this is the time for them to support him. Jim Acosta doesn't like the fact that he got booed at a Trump rally. Join the crowd. Assange doesn't like to be booed by journalists. So, he should be in solidarity, and so should everybody else with Julian Assange. Whether you like his MO, if you don't like it or you do like the way he does his business, that's beside the point. He is a journalist. He is an editor. He's a creative man. He's a very courageous man. And he's paid 6.5 years of his freedom, in this he's not well. I mean, you can't be well. I've been inside there. It's cramped quarters. It's the Ecuadorian embassy. It's very small. It's like, it's like smaller than the studio where he roams around at KPFA, the one that where Dennis Bernstein is, that studio next to it. And that includes, it's one floor. One floor, and you have a guy out front, you got the desk, and you got an ambassador, and you got personnel, and he's like ensconced in a very small portion of that building, and it's been a long period of time. I don't know, without internet right now, because of the U.S. They want to quiet this guy down the same way that the South, the slave powers, they wanted to, and they did kill journalists. Elijah Lovejoy in 1837, he was a great abolitionist, and he was not, 2 times they destroyed his printing press, then they mutilated his body and threw it into the Missouri River, whatever river there in Illinois, Illinois and Missouri, whatever that river is. But and the printing press was destroyed, and David Walker was poisoned. And, all these other journalists were threatened by the slave power because they didn't like what they were writing. And so now you have the U.S. power. They don't like what Julian Assange is saying. He's never been inaccurate. He's 100% accurate. We have been enriched by his work. We know more about what happened in Iraq, about journalists being killed. Okay, journalists being killed, being fired upon, citizens being tortured. We know about the DNC, how that election was rigged. That primary was rigged. He's just a messenger. We could have had someone who would have beaten Donald Trump if they had not rigged the primary scheme back in 2016. Did I answer that okay?
Yes.
So if you have any questions for me, I could go on forever, but I have a show tonight. I got to kind of put it together. I'll have someone talking about Julian Assange. That'd be Max Blumenthal, who's a great journalist. He knows about Syria. He knows, remember, he was taken down, Assange, just when he was talking about this thing in Salisbury, this so-called attack by Russians in Salisbury. Here they are partying in an apartment with Novichok, supposedly. They're partying, and everyone's getting drunk. There are hookers there, as if they would have a bottle of Novichok inside a place for everyone getting whacked out and playing around with prostitutes. So, Murray exposed that. Julian was just getting on to that, and suddenly the lights went out.
Okay, well, are there any questions for Randy Credico? Okay, if not, I want to thank you very much for joining us on his legal team.
Yes, it's
Yes, he's got Garrett.
Strong.
Gareth, I can't think of his last name, something Gareth, who is part of it. There is Garzone, who's part of it. He's been negotiating, I believe, with Ecuadorian government, solely him. But the late Michael Ratner was one of his attorneys. Jen Robinson, an Australian, very articulate, very forceful. She's brilliant. He's got Renata Avila, Guatemalan human rights lawyer, doing work in Guatemala in front of the OAS court. He does have an extent. Estelle DeHorn was the one for my friend from La Repubblica, and there are a few others. Melinda Robinson is doing the work in The Hague. He's got a number of lawyers that are working with him, mostly women lawyers. They're all brilliant lawyers, seriously. These are, with the exception of Garzone, and there's somebody, I think, in the U.S., the Center for Constitutional Rights, they have a lawyer assigned to him as well. And there's another lawyer in D.C. So he does have a lot of legal help. Most of it is pro bono, not all of it, I believe. So he really does have a sizable and a very potent legal
Legal defense team.
They've won some battles, but they have legal defense team, and they have this vigil that's outside every single day, led by a lot of Brits. They just stand around, and it's good. It's good that people are there at Knightbridge, right next to Harrods. I mean, he's like a quarter block away from Harrods, and the few times I visited him, I got lunch at Harrods, and that was like lunch money in high school for a whole year. Okay, that Harrods is the most expensive place. Fish and chips is 30 pounds, which is like $39 for fish and chips. But he certainly deserved it, and we had such a great conversationalist, very well versed on just about anything, and it was great conversation. I did mostly listening, but we had. He's got a great sense of humor, and he does a good impression of John Pilger. So he really is a remarkable individual. You look, there was a guy back in Russia, what was it, Kropotkin, who was in the Peter and Paul fortress prison in the 1870s, and it was like the size of a toll booth with no light, you know what I mean? A little window, and no guard could talk to him. He walked in circles for 2 years. That's all he did to keep his mind from going insane. So there are a few people. He's one of those guys of that kind of resilience that's able to. Very few could do this. Very few could do this. And so I give him a lot of credit. It's a great example. I don't think I could do it. 6 years and not get any sun, no dentist, no doctor. So he needs X-rays, he needs dental work, and they won't. This is how brutal the British government is. The British government is so brutal. The Metropolitan Police, even the mayor is supposed to be progressive, are not doing anything to facilitate improving his health. So this really is, and the UN Working Panel on Arbitrary Detention has come out twice condemning the British government, and they say it's binding. But they don't listen. They don't listen.
Okay.
Why is his lawyer saying so little?
The question is, why is his lawyer saying so little?
Is that part of a strategy?
What's that?
Is that part of his lawyer strategy? The lawyer's saying so little about his case. There doesn't seem to be any publicity.
I don't. The thing is, I don't speak. I can't speak so much for him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's yeah.
Because I don't.
Okay. One more question, and then we'll go on.
That
Yes.
is not fine with the defense.
Yeah.
I really don't know. I can just. The question is what? What's the question? I don't know what their strategy is.
The question was, okay, he doesn't know what their strategy is. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to know, so what's going to happen from here on in? I mean, is this going to continue and continue and continue? continue?
Well, there was a question, what's going to happen from here on in, Randy?
I don't know what's going to happen. All I can say is people just need to mobilize, and you can't write your congressman. You got the worst congressmen are in California. The Democrats, this guy Slewell, or whatever his name is, Slowell, and the guy Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff. I saw him at the White House. I actually got invited to the White House Correspondents' Center from this bizarre celebrity I've gotten out of being, Mr. Magoo. How I stepped into this, I don't know. But so I just kind of stepped. I'm like Zelig. I'm Zelig and the idiot, Michigan from The Idiot. That character. How I got mixed into this thing is like beyond me. Forrest Gump, I guess. And I ran into Adam Schiff, and Schiff invited me to have a conversation. And I went down and said, hey, look, if you go to the London embassy, to the Ecuador embassy in London, he will talk to you. He will make sure that you get to talk to him. He would not push you back. And so I said this on Ari Melber's show, and he retorts by saying, not to me, but to Melber's producers, that he will talk to him gladly once he's in U.S. custody. This is no way to be talking. This is Adam Schiff, your big progressive. Just take a look at where he's from. He's from Pasadena. He gets 40% of his money from arms manufacturers. You got to follow the money trail here. That's all I can tell you.
Good. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your talk.
Thanks very much. Keep it on.
Heard anyone on KPFA say that Assange should be arrested, which doesn't mean they haven't said it, but Brian Edwards Tiekert said that it was reasonable to summon Randy Credico, was reasonable for the House and or Senate Intelligence Committees to summon Randy Credico because he had been the intermediary between Roger Stone and Assange. Has never been proven. And the only evidence of that is that Randy Credico had both Roger Stone and Julian Assange on his show, Live on the Fly, on WBAI, KPFA's sister station in New York City. And in the same program, Brian said that it was reasonable to force RT to register as a foreign agent and surrender its press credentials to get into Congress, and called it a propaganda outlet. To be fair, Mitch Jeserich was on the same show, was trying to defend RT and saying, well, look, there are things you read there that you don't read anywhere else. But the way that KPFA and other Pacifica stations, I know most about KPFA, but the way that they have taken a swing to the right with the rest of the country and developed a case of Trump derangement syndrome, which reduces all politics to pro-Trump and anti-Trump, is really disturbing. So we need to push back at that, and we have a resolution before both KPFA and the Pacifica National Board in support of Assange. And they have not passed it yet, and there's actually been resistance. What the KPFA local station board keeps doing is pushing it down to the bottom of the agenda so they know they won't get to it. No Lies Radio made a video of the last KPFA local station board where a lot of people came to speak out for the Assange resolution and for bringing guns and butter back, or at least giving it due process and giving it a chance to have an opposing point of view to the one that got it thrown off the air. And No Lies Radio made a video of this. They weren't allowed to videotape the LSB. That's not happening because they seem to want to have these, they don't want to have roll call votes. And so they don't want people to see who's voting how. Is that how you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Steve's on the LSB. He's a staff rep on the LSB.
He told us about it.
Yeah, okay. So that's, you can write to the LSB, lsb@kpfa.org, and you can write to the Pacifica National Board, pnb@pacifica.org. You can write and tell them you want them to pass these Assange resolutions. The reason this is important, especially important, is that 3 years into Obama's presidency, let's see, I think it was the National Press Club, the Overseas Press Club, that a list of 3 or 4 press organizations, including one that was about freedom of information and defending journalists, who all deserted Assange. And so Pacifica really should distinguish itself from the mainstream press, as it's always asserting it does, by supporting Assange. Now, I'm going to talk about a few things I want to recommend. One is a movie that you can find online. It's called Media Stand. And this was made between 2010 and 2013. By this point, it's called Media Stand because it begins as they're traveling through Central Asia to Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, finally Afghanistan. And I probably left 1 or 2 out in between. Uzbekistan, yes. Thank you. And they're traveling through, it's 2010, say at the beginning. So the cables have been released, the diplomatic cables from US embassies all over the world and embassy staff. And they're looking for media partners to publish them, to publish the ones that are about these stand countries. It's very amusing. I just say, let me stop and say, this movie is funny and it's very dramatic because they're really walking into the highest echelons of power, eventually into the offices of the editors of the New York Times and the Guardian with this trove of information. But it covers 2010 to 2013. In the stand countries, the way it starts is very funny. They're driving along on their way to Tajikistan, and one of them is reading one of the cables along the way, a cable from a US ambassador in Tajikistan, and it says, these people have some exaggerated ideas of what we can do for them, including dubious power plants, tunnels to Afghanistan, and bridges to nowhere. However, the main thing that we need from them is for them to let us use Tajikistan as a base for planes that are going to go bomb Afghanistan. And they're very compliant about that. So that's just one of many comic moments. They eventually get thrown out of Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has oil that the Bushes have some interest in, and the president there, there's one newspaper which is operated by the president, and it has to have his picture on the front page every day. Not always the same picture, but a picture of him has to be on the front page every day. So they get kicked out of Turkmenistan. And then it goes into these negotiations with The Guardian and the New York Times. And there's some other just fascinating moments. And let's see, I didn't write notes, so I'm making this up as I go along. The other thing I want to say about this is that if you've seen the other movies about Julian Assange, you realize that they're almost all hit pieces. The one exception, two exceptions, Media Stand and, let's see, I've got to think of the name, Underground, It's Underground, The Making of Julian Assange or something like that, or The Early Life. It's about, it's about his life as a brilliant teenager, during which time he hacked into the Pentagon's computers at age 17 with an Amiga computer or some other such primitive technology. He and his mother both approved the one, Underground, The Making of Julian Assange, or something like that. Media Stan reveals him to be very cautious, very careful, very deep, profound in what he's doing, and respectful of all the people working with him on his team. By that time, he's under house arrest in Norfolk, England, and so he has to send his team out to try to find media partners in the stands. Don't see The Fourth Estate. The Fourth Estate is not only defames Julian Assange, it's really bad. It just makes him look like an irresponsible, reckless nut. And that's a Hollywood movie. The other ones that I've seen, like Risk by Laura Poitras and We Steal Secrets, those are informative, even though you can tell they're hit pieces. And one of the things about Risk, the film made by Laura Poitras, who concluded that he was a sexist, etc., was that it had him dealing with his girlfriend, Sarah Harrison, whom he met because she came to work on the project, treating her like a secretary because they've got a few things going. She's on the phone, and he's telling her what she should say. Actually, she's calling the State Department, and she's nervous about it. And he's coaching her, say, tell him this, tell him that. And there were other scenes like that where she looked like a secretary. In Media Stan, you hear her voice. She's very strong and independent, and you see him showing deference to her. Let's see. Okay, so that's recommending Media Stan. Yesterday, I started reading a book by Joe Loria, the editor of Consortium News, and it's called How I Lost by Hillary Clinton, with a foreword by Julian Assange. I asked Joe Loria when he was out here last week, how did you get away with that title, How I Lost by Hillary Clinton? And he said, they don't want to draw any attention to the book by making a fuss about it. It's a reading of the DNC and Podesta emails, along with some of the exchanges between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in debates, and a number of her speeches, the famous Wall Street speeches. One funny thing he says is, Hillary made speeches for anybody who paid. And there are two sections. One is called Hillary the Elitist, which is largely devoted to her relationship with the banks. At one point, she's telling them in a speech, look, after 2008, I went out there and faced the country for you. After the outrage about the bank bailout heist, I went out and took the flak. And she says, next time we have to figure out how to do this better, meaning how not to create such a political liability. Now, the second part of this book is about Hillary the Hawk. And I've just started that, but you probably all know a lot about Hillary the Hawk, so I'll just leave it there. And I think that's about it. I wanted to recommend these resources because you can learn a lot about Julian Assange and the primary source documents that he released by seeing Media Stan and reading How I Lost by Hillary Clinton. Oh, and How I Lost by Hillary Clinton has a brilliant introduction by Julian Assange?
We have to learn to talk to one another as a human being, and then try to understand, try to have empathy, and try to see other people's opinions, and you know, trying to see different points of view, and the political basically ideology, and then this whole, you know, the politics used as a control grid, really trying to label us, right? So then once we label someone, like if I talk to you and if I label you as right-wing, you know, radicalist or something, then I'm seeing you from that perspective, and I'm no longer listening to you anymore. I am, before you even speak, I already made a judgment about you, right? So that's kind of like where we start.
But where does our tactic?
Oh, to see again the tactics. That's because it's not right. But see, so that this whole idea of tactics and then methodology and then all of that stuff. I personally think that we should put them aside, and that we should go beyond these methodology and tactics, and that we should, you know, use this platform as a way to understand each other, for us to learn how to speak freely, and not so much like to have political advantage.
You know, the title of this forum is also about imperialism, because what we're facing today is a decline of U.S. imperialism. And what we're facing is increasing repression, increasing dangers of world war. I don't know if people heard, but the Trump administration has now told China that they can no longer trade with Russia. You know, I mean, can you imagine that? The United States telling China that they can't trade with Russia? Well, where are we going? We're going towards imperialist war. That's where we're going. So in the context of that, the need to repress freedom of speech is critical, because they don't want the working class to see what the reality is. The crimes of the capitalist parties are endemic. Democratic, Republican, the bombing of Libya, the bombing of Iraq, these are war crimes. That is why they're attacking Julian Assange, because he exposed these war crimes. And if you want to get in a debate with these right-wingers, I mean, you can point that out. The Republicans were involved in war crimes, along with the Democrats. Who votes for these trillion-dollar budgets? It's the Democrats with the Republicans. So they're together, they're tied together in the war crimes, which Julian Assange is exposing. So, and I think, though, that the need to defend Julian Assange should be, one of the aspects of it, should be by uniting those people who have an interest in exposing the war crimes of WikiLeaks, the theft by these corporations, the crimes of these corporations of activists. How has U.S. imperialism intervened against the people of the world? I mean, having a forum where people from different areas can talk about the role of U.S. imperialism and what was exposed in WikiLeaks. I mean, that's a way of showing to people it's not about Julian Assange. It's about exposing all these crimes that are going on around the world. And then people can make a connection that this is about free speech, but it's also about defending somebody who's exposing these crimes. And that, I think, is the way to build more education and make it not just a personality issue, but it's a system issue. The other thing, the suggestion about Sewell is a good one, of these Democrats, maybe organizing to go to his town hall meeting and raising the issue. Why are you covering up your crimes? Why are you covering up the crimes of the Democratic Party? You want to go after Julian Assange? What about your crimes? Who's holding you accountable and the Democratic Party? I mean, we need to call these people out for the criminals that they are. They're war criminals. When they vote for these policies, when they vote for the money, they're responsible and have to be held accountable for their crimes. That changes the political dynamic of the discussion. They don't want that kind of discussion about their own crimes. Let's talk about the supposed crimes of Julian Assange, who never killed anybody, who never spent money murdering people, who never committed genocide, which is the United States is doing right now in Yemen. You know, where they're bombing people. U.S. is bombing children and is destroying the country. I mean, that crime is being done by the United States government.
Marianne, you asked a very good question, and I'd like to give it a very simple answer. What we want to have for Julian Assange is a united front. Okay, now how does the united front work? The idea was invented by an old Russian socialist named Plekhanov. And he said the basic rule of united front was march separately and strike together. So we need to have, in common actions, we need to have united tactics, okay? But in program politics and ideas, in program politics and ideas, there must be complete freedom of discussion, and no one should hold back their political opinions, and no one should hold back on political criticisms of people they're allied with. That's the fundamental idea of a united front. And I'll say one thing, I totally agree that it is necessary to listen to different political viewpoints due to a fundamental principle of political, and by the way, there's no such, I don't see any difference between political attitudes and ideologies. Everyone has an ideology, everyone has political attitudes. Anyone who tries to deny that is fooling themselves. But the basic, you really have to understand what everyone's political, for the basic simple rule of political struggle, which is know your enemy.